Okay, well, hey, Martin, thanks so much for joining me on this fireside chat. Would love maybe a quick intro for all the folks who are joining us in Fluentcon, maybe who you are, what Chronosphere is. Yeah, just a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for having me, Anurag. I'm really excited to be here today, chatting with you. A little bit about myself. So my name's Martin. I'm currently the CEO and co-founder of Chronosphere. We provide a hosted monitoring solution to companies adopting cloud native. And we help these companies monitor their infrastructure, so primarily Kubernetes these days, monitor their applications, which is generally microservices oriented these days, and monitor their business as well in real time. And the core technology of our product really came out of Uber and a lot of the open source observability projects that came out of Uber. And that's actually where I spent 4 years of my career before founding Chronosphere. I led a core part of the observability team there, where we created projects such as M3, which is a distributed and scalable metric storage engine. It's compatible with Prometheus's long-term storage there for metrics. We created Jaeger, which is the CNCF graduated distributed tracing project. We actually completed the trifecta and created a logging platform as well internally, but unfortunately we never open sourced it. So yeah, spent a lot of time in my career in the observability space, both solving problems for Uber with these direct solutions, but also for the broader community via the open source channels as well. So a little bit about myself there, and again, really excited to be here today and looking forward to our chat.
Awesome. Yeah, and Jaeger alongside FluentD as a graduated CNCF project. So awesome to hear about all this observability journey and Uber, what a small app, right? I think as probably one of the leading folks in that observability space with Jaeger and all these other projects, I'm curious, what should companies be thinking about, or what should users actually be thinking about when solving for observability?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I love the fact that you put users in there, right? Because it is probably what the focus should be, is what should the users be thinking about. And even if we think about who the users of observability are, that's been changing fairly rapidly, I'd say, right? So historically, perhaps the users or practitioners of observability and monitoring has been isolated to the SRE department, or perhaps a core infrastructure team. However, if you think about modern development and application developer, they not only have to write and develop their application, they also have to test it, they have to deploy it, they have to monitor in production, they have to remediate issues when it goes wrong. So really for us, observability is more than just a practice. It's probably like a culture or mindset, much like how DevOps is. And it really is something that all developers, we are seeing embrace and adopt this culture and this mindset, and we're seeing that more and more. So really, the end users of observability is all the developers out there. And if you look at it from that perspective, they're really trying to optimize for one outcome, which is to know when something is wrong and to remediate that issue as quickly as possible, and ideally before end customers find out, right? Whether they're external customers or other perhaps engineering teams and whatnot. And I think optimizing for that outcome of remediating particular issues in their applications, really 3 questions that we're trying to solve and answer for here. The first of which is, can I get notified, and how quickly can I get notified when something goes wrong? Because if you don't even know when something goes wrong, or your customers find out before you, that's really not a great place to be in, I'd say. The second one is triage, right? So once you do get notified something is wrong, figuring out what is the impact. Is it impacting all of my customers or just a subset of my customers? Is it one cluster or another? If you get woken up in the middle of the night, is this something I have to deal with now, or can it wait until the morning? So, triaging the issue and knowing the impact is a fairly important question that we need to answer. And then the third step or phase or question that we do need to answer is, can I root cause this issue? Can I find out the underlying root cause of the issue and really provide a fix here for it? So, I think those are probably the 3 steps or phases, I'd say, that developers go through in achieving their outcome, which is to remediate the issue as quickly as possible. And for myself and for us, the team here at Chronosphere, that's what we think about when we think about observability, and that's what we think end users should focus on. We do hear a lot of definitions out there where it's more, I would say, concentrated around perhaps the data types like metrics, traces, and logs, and the 3 pillars per se. Those data types are definitely important for sure. But and they are the types of data we need to answer the question and arrive at our outcome. The data types by themselves don't really give you observability or better observability, right? Just ticking the 3 of them off and say, hey, I have logs, I have metrics, I have traces, doesn't necessarily mean you have observability or great observability. And producing more of each of those data types also doesn't lead to greater observability. So, we do think that an outcome-based approach for the end user, which is the developer, is perhaps a better way to think about observability as a whole, as opposed to a data approach there.
Yeah, no, it makes a ton of sense. I think everyone's getting hammered in with these 3 pillars,
Yeah.
logs, metric, traces. You gotta checkbox all of them, and yeah, it's sometimes we just forget about the user in those cases. And you mentioned like the 3 steps or phases. Are there things you'd recommend to users to like going about to meet those, or maybe you can help clarify those pieces a little bit?
Yeah, would love to double click on that for sure. So yeah, when I mentioned the 3 phases, they are, I guess, phases or steps in the sense that they are generally sequential, right? You have to do one before the other. You do have to get notified that something is wrong before you can go and fix the issue for sure. I'll say that, the best way to think about these 3 steps or phases is that it's still, again, optimizing for the outcome, which is remediation. And it's not necessary that you have to go through all 3 phases to remediate an issue, right? So if you think about it, if you're mid deploying your service and you get notified that something is wrong, first course of action is probably to roll back that deploy instantly, right? And that could be your way of remediating the issue. You don't know the root cause there, but you've remediated the issue, you've avoided customer impact, I'd say. And that's really what you're trying to optimize for, right? So it's really about that. And perhaps at the notification phase, you can remediate instantly. So there's no need to go triage and to root cause the issue. You can sort of do that after the fact. And I think that's important as well. You don't really want to be doing sort of root cause analysis live during the incident with the pressure of knowing that the business is down or impacted or anything like that. Perhaps, and I'd say also generally issues are introduced when we change a system. When we leave a system alone, generally there's not as many issues. And I would say the highest percentage of causes of issues is when we introduce change to a particular system. So perhaps when you get notified there, that resolution or step to remediation is fairly quick. The second one is triage. So, definitely there are a bunch of situations where just being notified isn't enough. You're not actively introducing a change to the system. So you do want to triage the issue in the sense of knowing what is impacted, what is the impact to, subsets of my customer base, perhaps, or all of my customer base. Perhaps, you can isolate the issue down to one cluster or one availability zone or one region, right? And I think that helps you know how bad the issue is and how much sort of urgency you need to put into resolving the issue. But often we find that at that step, you can also remediate fairly easily without root cause analysis. And you can imagine, most of our modern architectures are spread across multiple clusters, multiple availability zones, multiple regions. So a quick sort of resolution to that, to remediation, perhaps is to route your request around those impacted zones or clusters, right? If you know the issue is isolated to cluster A or to zone A, route your request away from that, such that again you've remediated the issue and your customers are not impacted. Yet you have time to really figure things out, not under that time pressure. And then there are definitely occasionally those issues where you can't do any of the first 2, and you really have to get dug in and really dig at what the root cause is in production. Again, this is probably not the preferable one. I'm sure developers would prefer not to have to debug things live in production under the time pressure of actual impact to the business. But that does need to happen sometimes. And when it does, you really got to get dug in there, figure out what the root cause is, roll out a fix, and remediate the issue that way. So, they are sort of sequential and dependent on each other. But I think, again, the outcome is remediation as quickly as possible. And from any of the steps, you can really achieve that outcome as quickly as possible. And I think that's the best way to think about those 3 phases there.
Yeah, no, it helps a lot. And I think as you talk about remediation, is there, going a little bit back to kind of the 3 pillars and the 3 data types, are there certain data types that make themselves or lend themselves to make it easier to remediate, right? Is like metrics or traces, is that going to help you move faster, or how do the data types kind of relate back to all of this?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the short answer is yes, but there's obviously a lot of details in that. I think when we think about the data types, and as I mentioned earlier, just by having all three checked off doesn't lead to better observability in any way, and just having more of each data type doesn't really accomplish that or achieve that either. I think if you look at the outcome, which is remediation, and the phases, there are particular data types that are better suited to particular phases, right? So if you think about notification, generally when you're trying to be notified of something, that notification is generally done in an aggregate view of all of your data or all of your requests, perhaps, right? So, you're looking at how many requests am I getting per second? How many errors am I getting per second? What's the aggregate latency of those particular requests? So I think, to answer or to help with the notification phase of the problem, metric data is generally a more optimal type of data to go and solve that problem. Doesn't necessarily mean it's the only one and it's the necessary one, but if you think about what you're trying to measure there, it's really an aggregate view of numerical data. You're counting things, or you're measuring the latency, and generally metrics, which is values over time. And if you think about notification and alerting, you're generally checking those numerical values against a particular threshold. So I think metrics is perhaps better suited for the notification phase of things. Perhaps triage a little bit as well. If you think about triage, you're really trying to dig at one level deeper into the error count or into the latency a little bit, and then perhaps having labels or tags on your metric data to be able to slice and dice by a particular cluster or an AZ or region can help you with triage there for sure. And the actual individual request itself perhaps is not as required for those phases. But as you shift later into the phases in the process a little bit into more deeper triage and root cause analysis, I think that does lend itself to data types like logs and traces a little bit more, because logs and traces are by default a little bit more verbose, have a little bit more information there. And I think, as that transitions, there are definitely, I would say, logs and traces are perhaps more efficient at solving those particular phases of the problem. So, I think all three types, and I'm sure they exist for a particular reason, all three types are definitely useful throughout the whole process for sure. But in my mind, it's a little bit about optimizing for the particular phase. And now this doesn't mean that you need to have all three instrumented, right? And I think this is what is great about the announcement earlier today about Fluent Bid and sort of extracting metric data off of logs, because quite often it doesn't mean that you need to go and instrument for all three types of data, but converting between one type to another type to optimize for the use case is a great advantage, I guess. And again, really happy to see Fluent Bid and Fluent go down that path and enabling those use cases.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that. I think we have a couple sessions at Fluentcon that are going to talk a little bit about more on the tracing side with Fluent Bid, as well as just the metric side. Would love to just get your thoughts about maybe metrics, logs, how these things all stem together, and Fluent Bid's kind of new announcement there.
Yeah, for sure. So, I think there'll be a session later today from Mike at Neiman Marcus. And if you look at that session, I don't want to ruin his session by any means, but he was already, via a custom plugin, already generating metrics off of logs, right? So this is already happening, even though there is first-class support now in Fluent Bid, which I think is great. Users were already doing this out of necessity. And if you look at Mike's use case, it really is to extract metric data off of the logs so that he can alert off of this and get faster notifications, because again, metrics is perhaps a better optimal method of that phase than logs is, right? So, I think this is already something that end users are leveraging already, and the need is there already. I think what's great about the announcement, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Anurag, but I believe the capability of extracting metrics from logs has existed in Fluent and Fluent Bid for quite a while, but the big announcement today is that it's happening in the metric extraction component. It's happening in Prometheus format. And I think that is also really great for the industry as a whole, right? And if you take a step back and look at the monitoring and observability industry, has been a huge shift towards open source standards, right? So, for Fluent D is the graduated sort of CNCF project for logging, same for Prometheus for metrics. And I think that the best part of that isn't that there is a solution. It's great that there is a standardized solution, but that there's standardization around the format of the data there, right? So if you look at all of the projects in the CNCF ecosystem, most of them are, in fact, if not all of them, are emitting metric data. If we take metrics as an example, emitting metric data in the Prometheus format already. And I think that is hugely advantageous for the industry as a whole, because it means from an end user perspective, from a developer perspective, you're not locked into one storage solution, whether that's a storage solution you're hosting yourself, or whether that's like a vended storage solution, right? You can instrument in one way, in one protocol, and every solution out there sort of supports it, right? And again, from the metrics perspective, if you look at the backends, there's a lot of different solutions out there. In addition to Prometheus, I mentioned M3 is one that we open sourced out of Uber, but Cortex and Thanos is there and available as well. And I think the sort of movement to these standards and the power of that movement is also seen by all the vendors that are providing monitoring and metrics-based solutions as well, in the sense that they all have to support Prometheus as a protocol now as well, right? And again, all of this I think is great for the end user and the industry at large, is because you're not locked into one technology as a backend, or you're not locked into one vendor as a backend, which I think is great. So it's great to see that that ability is supported at first class now in Fluent Bit, but also that the exposition format is in the industry standard, which is Prometheus, and that's great to see, I would say.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's how we were thinking about it from the Fluent D side, the Fluent Bit side. How do we just conform with the standards? And I think a big upcoming project in this space is definitely open telemetry. And we announced some earlier stuff today where we're saying, hey, we're going to have some integrations going on with the protocols they're building. Would love to get maybe your take on the approach of that project, these projects together, and just maybe your take on open telemetry.
Yeah, we'd love to. I assume most folks watching this call are somewhat familiar with open telemetry, but if not, it is a collection of APIs and SDKs, again, with the goal of standardizing the protocols and the clients that is generating all of this observability data. So overall, as a whole, as a project, I love it because it's pushing the industry towards more open source standards for sure. I think if you look at open telemetry, and the project really started off around having sort of standard client libraries for disparate trace data. It expanded over time to include metric data. And I believe then, the natural progression would be to expand it even further over time to include log data as well, right? And if you look down that path, and they have, similar, again, APIs and SDKs across all of the major programming languages, which again, standardizes the instrumentation and the production of the data, which I think is great. If you look at it as a project, it has support for tracing right now. Metric support is being added actively right now, and I think log may be coming soon. And I think that's going to be great for the industry moving forward. I think, perhaps in a year or two, or perhaps even sooner than that, you'll see a lot of the applications we are writing instrument in open telemetry from the beginning. And that's great. And in fact, it's not only just the three protocols there, it's a single client for all three types of data, or at least two types of data right now, and perhaps a third type down the line. I think that's great for new applications moving forward. But I think if you look at it from a practical lens of the things that we need to monitor today, there is so much existing instrumentation that is pretty, I would say, impractical to go back and re-instrument from like a company's perspective for existing custom applications they've written themselves. Or sometimes it's impossible because you're pulling, a dependent library or an upstream project that you're using, and you don't really even have control on how those things are instrumented. So I do think that, open telemetry hopefully is the future, and that is the standard there eventually. I think taking it from a practical, looking at it from a practical perspective, I think projects like Fluent D and Fluent Bit are great here because there is a lot of sort of backward support for existing protocols and existing instrumentation that exists today. And it's tackling the problem not from a client perspective, but from like a processing perspective outside of the application itself. So I think, that is a very different way of solving the problem. And I think it's one that's going to be required as we sort of handle a transition that's going to be for multiple years. And I think, you know, with this design of Fluent and Fluent D, where you're processing outside of the application itself, lends itself to have other advantages as well. So one of the companies we work with, they're called Tecton. When we talked to them about their use of FluentBit, what they were using it for was to actually augment the stream of log data that was coming out of the application itself with additional metadata around the environment that it's running. And so they were augmenting it with the cluster and the namespace of the Kubernetes cluster that they were running in, right? And I think that is a hugely powerful thing to be able to do. And I think they were using, I can't remember the exact feature name, I believe it's called the rewrite tag feature or something like that in FluentBit. But I think, you know, that adds a bunch of fairly powerful additional value as well, in the sense that, you know, now you can sort of standardize the additional metadata that you add to the streams, which is always a hard problem to solve, right? You can imagine if you ask every developer to emit environment or the cluster name, who knows, you know, which way they're going to go do it in a standard format. There's going to be weird camel casing and all sorts of other things in there, right? So I think being able to do it in one centralized location is important. And again, sometimes if you look at it from the end user perspective, sometimes it's actually really hard if you're an application developer, when you're writing your application and instrumenting your application, it's actually really hard to even know, hey, which cluster am I going to be running in? How am I going to go get that data? It's actually something that may not be possible from the application developer perspective. So I think this approach from Fluent and FluentBit of sort of processing all of the existing streams of data coming out adds additional value there and unlocks a bunch of use cases for sure. And as you mentioned, I believe there will be support for all of the protocols that over Telemetry are going to be crafting and standardizing as well. So, you know, sort of, it's not an either or thing. It's a different pattern. I think both will really help the industry as a whole moving forward.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think, you know, both of us would probably agree that observability has changed significantly in the last 3 years. New projects, new protocols, new standards. You know, as someone who's at the forefront of this, what do you think the next 3 years hold? Like, what is maybe the future in Martin Mao's mind of observability?
Yeah, I'd say the future is always hard to predict for sure. But yeah, let's definitely have a crack at it. You know, I think if you look at the future, what I believe is, you know, this trend that I talked about at the beginning, where every developer adopts this observability mindset, I think will continue, right? And I think there will be a huge transfer of both knowledge and skill set from that core SRE team, from the experts in these practices today, to all developers everywhere. And I really hope that transition continues to happen. I think as that transition happens, and this is hopefully as well, as that transition happens, there is a focus on the outcome as opposed to the input or the data types as well. So I do see that happening over the next 3 years. So, you know, having the developers optimize for the outcome, which is remediation, as quickly as possible. And I think if you assume that is the direction things are moving, and I think there are a few implications of that, or a few outputs of that. One of which is, I think you're going to see a lot more of what we're seeing already, where there is conversion between the 3 data types to optimize for the various phases that, you know, and really the developers are going to be optimizing for the various phases here. So I do think you'll see a lot more of this, what we're seeing today already, of like transferring between the data types to solve a particular phase and to remediate as quickly as possible. But not just that, I do also think that, you know, as part of this shift, I think there is also going to be, I think, better context being passed between each of the phases are there as well. So, you know, going from notification to triage to root cause analysis, going through the 3 phases there, I think there'll be a focus and sort of innovation on passing more context throughout each of those. And, you know, one example I can give here is my co-founder, Rob Skillington, gave a talk a couple of years ago at KubeCon, where we showed how you could jump from a metric data point on a dashboard, which you would use for notification and triage, straight into the underlying request in the distributed trace system, which you would use for root cause analysis, right? So really trying to not begin your search again as you go through the phases, but really take the sort of effort you put in from each phase and sort of use that more effectively in the next phase. So I do think that we'll see, you know, more things there. And actually, I think that we'll also see sort of better integration between the tiers as well, right? And by tiers, I mean infrastructure and the application tier, right? So you can imagine, and I think you may have alluded to this earlier today, that there are some plans on Fluent and Fluent to also sort of collect infrastructure stats or infrastructure metrics from the hardware itself, in addition to the streams of, let's say, log messages you're getting from applications, right? And I think having that in one place perhaps unlocks a bunch of potentials as well, in the sense that, you can imagine if you know that there is a particular spike in infrastructure and CPU or disk usage around a particular time, and you know which applications are emitting data from that particular instance because you're processing it in a single place, you can imagine that there could be better correlations there, and that could sort of unlock a lot of value as well, right? So, I think all of that will be sort of outputs of hopefully this sort of focus on outcome and driving better outcomes for the end user developers. I do think that there are going to be sort of other implications of this as well. And I think one of the implications is that the amount of observability data that's going to be produced is going to continue to grow up and to the right. And I think that's going to probably grow and outpace the growth of infrastructure overall, right? Because as more developers adopt this mindset, there's going to be more instrumentation and more data produced. And it's going to be great because, we needed to get to better remediation, but I think the unintended consequence of that is a lot more data being produced. And it's not something that's just limited to, I would say, the monitoring of the observability space. We see this in large data as well, and other industries as well. And I'd say that has implications for the central observability team or the SRE team that is managing and running all of the infrastructure and all the observability tooling that the rest of the developers use and depend on. And there's probably two large implications there. The first of which is, I think that as the observability tooling becomes a more of a important tool, I would say, in the toolset of developers, the reliability of that system is gonna become more important. And this is coming from my experience at Uber, where we built a hugely powerful metrics backend storage. Yet we couldn't prevent a single developer from writing a single line of code that inadvertently emitted high cardinality metrics, or inadvertently emitted, you can imagine, a lot of log messages, and took down the backend and impacted every other developer in the company, right? So I think there's going to be a lot more focus on reliability of those tools, just because there's going to be a larger dependence on those tools. And then the second of which is, I do think that the monitoring data is, as I mentioned earlier, is going to outpace and grow at a much faster rate than our spend or our use of infrastructure. And I think at a certain point, the central observability team or the SRE team is going to have to focus on how to implement best practices for the developers to understand the implications of their instrumentation and sort of optimize this data that's being produced to still solve the problem and optimize the outcome, but perhaps not in a way that's like, hey, just produce as much data as you can and sort of hope for the best. So I think there will be a lot of focus on how to deal with that side of the problem as well, looking forward. But yeah, it's probably my best guess at what we're going to see in the next 3 years here.
Awesome. Yeah, I know. I think everyone's going to be a part of it, right? If you're watching this, you are probably at the forefront of observability. So really appreciate your answer and your honesty, right? It's maybe an expensive future. So with that, I think yeah, we can go ahead and close up. And thank you so much again, Martin, for your time and your insights. And yeah, we'll chat again soon.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me today. And hopefully next time we chat, we can do it in person. Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed.